The light blue dress was the first thing Caleb saw, a smudge of impossible color against the dusty gold of the hay. He had risen before the sun, as he always did, to check on a mare due to foal. The air in the barn was thick with the familiar scents of horse and leather and dry grass, but something else was there too, a stillness that was not empty but occupied. He stopped dead in the entryway, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. There, curled in a mound of clean straw in an empty stall, was a woman. She was small, her black hair a stark spill against the pale hay. The dress she wore was a simple prairie cut, the kind a farmer's wife might own, but its color was washed out from sun and wear, and the hem was frayed and dark with grime. It was the wrong dress for the wrong person in the wrong place. And she was Chinese. Caleb had seen the railroad workers in Carson City, men with long braids and quiet faces, but he had never seen a woman. Not here, not in the middle of his and his brother's ranch, miles from any town. He backed away slowly, his worn boots making no sound on the packed earth floor. His mind, usually a slow and steady thing, raced. He found his brother, Ben, by the water pump, splashing his face against the coming heat of a Nevada summer. Ben was the talker, the thinker, the one who handled the books and the business. Caleb was the one who understood the land and the animals. "There's someone in the barn," Caleb said, his voice low. Ben straightened up, wiping his face on his sleeve. "A drifter? Run him off. We can't afford to feed another stray." "Not a drifter," Caleb said. "A woman. In the far stall." Ben's expression shifted from irritation to sharp concern. He dried his hands on his trousers and followed Caleb back to the barn, his stride longer, more urgent. They stood together in the shadows, looking at the sleeping figure. She stirred, a small sigh escaping her lips, and curled tighter into the hay. She looked impossibly fragile, like a bird fallen from its nest. "What in God's name is she doing here?" Ben whispered, his voice stripped of its usual confidence. The situation had no clear lines, no precedent. There was no rulebook for this. "Don't know," Caleb replied. "But she's alone. And looks like she's been walking a long time." He nodded toward her feet. Even from a distance, he could see the worn-out soles of her thin shoes. They were ranchers, not rescuers. Their life was a narrow set of demanding routines governed by the sun and the seasons. Their father had left them the homestead claim, a respectable spread of land that was good for cattle but unforgiving of mistakes. They worked from before dawn until after dusk, and they were solvent, just barely. A complication like this, a lone foreign woman appearing in their barn, was a spark in a tinderbox of social convention. The nearest town, dusty and judgmental, would have 1,000 cruel questions and no kind answers. Ben ran a hand through his damp hair. "We can't just leave her here." "But we can't keep her." The unspoken words hung in the air between them. A woman in their home, a home with no wife, no mother, no sister, would be a scandal. A Chinese woman would be something else entirely, something dangerous. But as the first true rays of sun slanted through the barn's high window, lighting the dust motes and catching the pale blue of her dress, Caleb saw her hand, resting near her face. It was small, with long fingers, but the knuckles were scraped raw, and dirt was ground deep into the lines of her palm. It was the hand of someone who had been clinging to something, or scrambling over rough ground. It was the hand of someone who had not given up. "She can stay the day," Caleb said, his voice quiet but firm. "It wasn't a suggestion. We'll give her food and water. Then we figure it out." Ben looked from the woman to his brother's set face. He saw no argument there. He gave a short, sharp nod. "All right. One day." They left her to wake on her own and went about their morning chores, the rhythm of their work a comfort against the disruption. They mended a fence line, cleared stones from a new pasture, and spoke little, each brother turning the problem over in his own mind. When the sun was high and hot, they returned to the homestead. The woman was gone from the barn. A knot of anxiety tightened in Caleb's chest. He scanned the yard. Then, Ben pointed toward the small clapboard house they shared. She was sitting on the back step, near the rain barrel, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had tried to tidy herself, pulling her hair back and brushing the worst of the straw from her dress. As they approached, she stood, her eyes cast down, her posture a mixture of fear and dignity. She was younger than Caleb had first thought, her face thin but her features clear and fine. She said nothing. Ben, ever the practical one, spoke first. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" She looked up, her dark eyes moving between the two brothers. She understood the tone, if not the words, and gave a small, hesitant nod. She then spoke, a string of soft, musical sounds that meant nothing to them. "She doesn't speak English," Ben stated the obvious, a fresh layer of complication settling over them. Caleb went inside and came back with a tin cup of water and a piece of leftover cornbread from their breakfast. He held them out to her. Her eyes widened slightly, and she took them with a quiet grace, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. She drank the water in slow, deliberate sips, as if measuring her thirst. She ate the cornbread just as carefully, leaving no crumbs behind. When she was done, she held the empty cup out to him, a question in her eyes. Caleb took it and gestured for her to sit again on the step. They stood there for a long moment, two big, sun-browned men and one small, lost woman, the vast, silent prairie stretching out around them. There was no easy answer. Sending her to town would be like throwing a lamb to wolves. The sheriff would put her on a wagon headed for the coast, and what would happen to her then, a woman alone with no money and no English, was a grim picture. But keeping her here felt just as impossible. Then Ben, who always saw the angles, saw the work, had an idea. It was a mad idea, born of desperation and a decency he rarely showed. He walked over to a patch of flat, sun-baked ground about 50 yards from the main house, near a stand of cottonwoods that marked a small creek. He kicked at the dirt with the toe of his boot. "The old dugout caved in years ago," he said, more to himself than to Caleb. "But the spot is good. Sheltered from the wind. Close to water." Caleb watched him, understanding dawning slowly. "What are you saying, Ben?" "I'm saying we can't put her in the barn like an animal. And we can't have her in the house. But a man with a homestead claim is allowed to build on his land." He looked over at the woman, who was watching them with a guarded, unreadable expression. "We've got the timber from the north pasture we cleared last fall. We've got the tools. A small place. One room. Just a shelter." It was more than a shelter, it was a statement. It was drawing a line on their own land and declaring her under their protection. It was a foolish, reckless, and deeply compassionate act. Caleb looked at his brother, then at the woman on the step, and then at the wide, empty land that was their home. He thought of her scraped hands and the exhaustion etched on her face. He gave a single, slow nod. "All right," he said. "Let's get the shovels." They worked through the hottest part of the day, a time they usually rested. They measured out a simple square, digging into the hard-packed earth to lay a foundation. The woman, whose name they did not know, watched them from the shade of the porch. She did not move, her stillness a silent vigil over their labor. As they worked, the ranch hands, a handful of weathered men who kept to themselves, came in from the range for their midday meal. They saw the brothers digging, saw the woman on the step, and understood that something had changed. They asked no questions, simply took their plates of beans and bacon and ate in the shade of the bunkhouse, their eyes occasionally drifting toward the strange scene. The work was hard, but it felt right. Every spadeful of earth, every swing of the axe to trim a log, felt like an answer to a question they hadn't known how to ask. They were building something more than a cabin. They were building a refuge. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Ben finally straightened up, wiping a forearm across his sweat-soaked brow. "That's enough for one day. We'll have the foundation set by tomorrow noon." Caleb nodded, his shoulders aching. They had laid out the footprint of a small, sturdy cabin. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. He looked over at the woman. She was still there, a silhouette against the fading light. He did not yet know that this small act of charity would change their lives more profoundly than any drought or cattle drive ever could. He only knew that for the first time, the vast emptiness of their land felt a little less lonely. The next morning, she was gone from the step. A brief panic seized Caleb until he smelled it: coffee. Real coffee, not the bitter, boiled grain swill they usually drank. And something else, something savory and rich. He found her in their kitchen. The room was a place of function for him and Ben, usually cluttered with dirty plates and smelling of stale bacon grease. Now, it was clean. The surfaces were wiped, the floor swept. And the woman was standing over their cast-iron stove, stirring something in a pot. She had found their meager supplies: a sack of flour, some dried beans, a half slab of salt pork, and a small tin of coffee Ben had been saving. From these humble ingredients, she was creating a miracle. On the table were a stack of what looked like thin, perfectly round pancakes, and the pot on the stove sent up a steam that smelled of spices Caleb couldn't name. She turned as they entered, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. She gestured toward the table, then to the stove. An offering. Ben and Caleb exchanged a look of disbelief. They sat down, and she served them, placing the delicate pancakes on their plates and ladling a thick, savory stew of beans and pork over them. The first bite silenced them. It was the best food either of them had ever tasted. The pancakes were light and fluffy, and the stew was complex, the salt pork transformed into something tender and flavorful. She had found a small bag of dried chilies in the back of their pantry, long forgotten, and used them to create a warmth that spread through their chests. She had made their crude ingredients sing. They ate everything, sopping up the last of the stew with the last of the pancakes. When they were finished, they looked at her with a new kind of respect. She was not just a victim they had pitied, she was a woman of profound and unexpected skill. "My name is Caleb," he said, pointing to his chest. "He is Ben," he pointed to his brother. She watched his mouth, then pointed to herself. "Leanne," she said. Her voice was soft, the name a single, clear note in the quiet kitchen. That afternoon, a rider approached the ranch. It was Jedediah Sterling, their neighbor to the east. Sterling was a man who had gotten rich not by working the land, but by controlling it. He owned the largest ranch in the county, held the note on half the businesses in town, and had a way of looking at other people's property as if it were merely waiting for his signature. He was a man whose politeness was a weapon. He reined in his fine black horse, his gaze sweeping over the ranch with an air of casual appraisal. It lingered on the foundation they were digging. "Morning, boys," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "Putting up an addition?" "Just a small outbuilding," Ben replied, his tone neutral. He and Caleb stood between Sterling and the house, a silent, defensive line. Sterling's eyes narrowed, catching a flicker of movement on the porch. Leanne had stepped out, drawn by the voice, and then frozen, retreating partway into the shadows. But Sterling had seen her. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," he drawled. "Looks like you've taken on some new help. The railroad finished laying track months ago. I thought all their workers had moved on." His meaning was clear and ugly. "She's not our help," Caleb said, his voice low and cold. "And she's under our protection." Sterling's smile widened. "Protection? From what? The law? There are vagrancy statutes in this territory, you know. A person with no papers, no clear purpose, the sheriff can be very particular about that." He was not just making an observation, he was making a threat. He was reminding them of his influence in town, of how easily he could make trouble for them. He could turn their act of kindness into a crime. Just then, one of the ranch horses, a young gelding tethered near the corral, spooked at a snake slithering through the dust. It reared back, eyes wide with terror, pulling hard against its rope. One of the ranch hands started forward, but before he could get there, Leanne moved. She flowed from the porch, not running, but moving with a swift, silent purpose. She didn't approach the horse from the front, but circled around, speaking in a low, crooning tone, the same soft language she had used with them. The horse's ears twitched. It stopped pulling, its panicked breathing slowing as it turned its head to watch her. She reached its side and gently, confidently, ran a hand down its neck, her touch steady and calming. The horse quieted, dropping its head and nudging her shoulder. Everyone stood frozen, watching. Sterling's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Leanne, this small, silent woman, had just handled a half-panicked horse with more skill and less fear than any man present. She gave the horse a final pat and retreated to the porch as quietly as she had come. The spell was broken. Ben turned back to Sterling, his jaw set. "I think you were just leaving, Mr. Sterling." Sterling stared for a moment longer, his mind clearly reassessing the situation. This was not as simple as he had thought. He gathered his reins, his polished smile returning, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You boys be careful," he said, his voice soft again, but now laced with something sharp. "Charity can be an expensive business out here." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. That night, the mood was tense. Sterling's visit had brought the outside world crashing into their isolated act of mercy. They now knew their decision to help Leanne had an enemy, a powerful one. After their silent dinner, Ben went over the account books, his brow furrowed with worry. Caleb found Leanne by the half-finished foundation of her cabin, staring at the raw earth and timber under the moonlight. The fear was plain on her face now. Caleb stood beside her, not speaking for a long time. He didn't have the words to reassure her, not in a language she could understand. He gestured to the foundation. "Home," he said, patting one of the foundation logs. "Your home." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. Then, she reached into the collar of her worn blue dress and pulled out a small, folded piece of oilcloth. She carefully unwrapped it and handed it to him. Inside was a piece of paper, a letter written in neat columns of Chinese characters. Tucked into the fold was a small, intricately carved jade pendant of a fish. The paper was soft and frayed along the creases, as if it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. She pointed to a name written in English at the bottom of the page, John Miller, foreman, Central Pacific Line, Victory Summit. Then she made a gesture, pointing to herself, then holding up a ring finger, and then shaking her head with a look of profound sadness. She drew a shape in the air, the shape of a steam engine, and made a sound like a train whistle, pointing east, the direction Sterling had come from. Finally, she rubbed her fingers together, the universal sign for money, and then opened her hands to show they were empty before pointing to the phantom train, a gesture of theft and departure. Caleb understood. She was a bride, or was meant to be. This John Miller had sent for her, promised marriage, and when she arrived, he, or someone else, had taken her money and abandoned her. She had been walking, trying to find her way in a land where she was utterly alone. The blue dress was likely the only thing she owned, perhaps given to her for the new life that had never begun. A cold anger settled in Caleb's gut, solid and heavy. The injustice of it was staggering. He carefully refolded the letter and handed it back to her. He tapped his own chest. "Caleb," he said again. Then he pointed to the ground beneath their feet. "Home," he repeated the word, trying to pour all the conviction he felt into that single sound. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of something other than fear in her eyes. It was a fragile, tentative trust. The next 2 weeks passed in a rhythm of hard work and good food. The cabin rose log by log, a testament to the brothers' quiet determination. In return, Leanne transformed their lives from the kitchen. The ranch hands, who had initially been wary, were won over completely. They were healthier, stronger, and their morale was higher than it had ever been. Leanne's cooking was more than just sustenance, it was a kind of care they hadn't realized they were missing. She learned their names, packing extra biscuits for the youngest hand and saving the crispiest pieces of bacon for the oldest. The ranch began to feel less like a workplace and more like a community. But Sterling's shadow lingered. One afternoon, he returned. This time, he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a portly man in a dusty suit, the territorial clerk from the county seat. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Sterling said, dismounting. "Mr. Davies here was just reviewing some old land deeds." And a very interesting discrepancy has come to light regarding your father's original homestead claim. Ben stepped forward. Our deed is sound. It was filed and approved 20 years ago. The clerk, Davies, cleared his throat, avoiding their eyes. There appears to be a conflict with the survey of Mr. Sterling's adjoining property line. The original surveyor's markers are ambiguous. According to this revised survey, he unrolled a fresh-looking map. This entire section, including your little creek and that new structure, actually falls within Mr. Sterling's legal property. It was a lie, a legal fiction cooked up by Sterling's money. But it was a powerful one. They were being robbed in broad daylight, with the thin veneer of the law as a weapon. You can't be serious, Caleb said, his hands clenching into fists. Oh, I am, Sterling said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Of course, I'm a reasonable man. I'd be willing to overlook this error. All you have to do is remove the illegal structure. And get rid of the vagrant you're harboring. Then we can forget this whole unfortunate business. The choice was laid bare. Give up Leanne and her home, or lose a vital piece of their land, their only source of water besides the main well. It would cripple their ranch. Ben looked at Caleb, his face pale. All their work, their father's legacy, was on the line. For a moment, the weight of the decision seemed to crush the air out of the yard. Retreating was the sensible option, the only way to survive. But then Caleb looked past Sterling, toward the house. Leanne was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, a wooden spoon in her hand, her face a mask of quiet dread. She had made this place a home for them in a way it had never been before. She had fed them, cared for them, and faced her own terror with a silent strength that humbled him. They had built her a house of wood and mud, but she had built them a home of warmth and belonging. He would not let a man like Sterling tear it down. No, Caleb said, his voice ringing with clarity. You're not taking our land. And you're not touching her home. He took a step forward. You and your forged map can get off our property. Now. Sterling's face hardened, the mask of civility dropping away. You'll regret this. I'll see you ruined. Get out, Ben echoed, finding his voice, standing shoulder to shoulder with his brother. Sterling and the clerk mounted their horses and rode off, their threats hanging in the hot, still air. The fight was no longer a quiet, personal one. It was now a legal war they had no idea how to win. 3 months later, the first snow of winter dusted the high peaks of the Sierras. The legal battle had been brutal and expensive. Ben had to sell a dozen head of prime cattle to pay for a lawyer in Carson City, a trip that took him away for 2 weeks. But he had returned not with a defeat, but with their father's old saddlebag. Tucked inside a leather pouch was a faded, hand-drawn map, the original survey their father had commissioned, complete with the surveyor's signature and the territorial seal, dated a year before Sterling's claim had even been filed. It proved their ownership of the creek beyond any doubt. Sterling's claim was dismissed as fraudulent, and his reputation in the county suffered a blow from which it would not soon recover. The cabin was finished. It was a simple, sturdy building, chinked with mud and clay, with a stone chimney that sent a steady plume of pale smoke into the crisp autumn air. A small garden, now dormant under a layer of straw, was laid out beside it. Leanne stood in its doorway, watching Caleb repair a harness. She no longer wore the faded blue prairie dress. Ben had bought her 2 new ones in town, made of sturdy, warm calico, one brown and one a dark green. She had a home, a place in the world that was hers. Her English was still halting, but she and the brothers had found their own language of gestures, shared work, and mutual respect. The ranch was thriving. With the money saved from Leanne's resourceful cooking and management of their supplies, they had ended the season with a larger profit than any year before. Caleb finished his work and walked toward her. The evening meal was soon, and the whole ranch now ate together at long tables Ben and the hands had built, the air filled with talk and laughter instead of the weary silence of old. He stopped before her, looking at the solid little house. He thought of that first morning, of the smudge of blue in the golden hay, a sight so out of place it had felt like a dream. They had offered her a refuge, a place to be safe. but she, in turn, had given them something far greater. She had taken their harsh, lonely existence and filled it with flavor, with care, with a quiet strength that had reminded them of their own. Home, he realized, wasn't just a plot of land or a roof over your head. It was the thing you built, day by day, with the people who chose to stand with you. It was the warmth of a fire, the smell of bread baking, and the simple, unspoken knowledge that you were no longer alone. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.